Donc j'ai le plaisir de vous présenter Peter Arkadiev, qui nous rend visite là pour 4 séminaires comme professeur invité de l'ABEX. Il va parler sur la thématique de l'omniprédicativité. Peter a étudié la linguistique à Moscou, où il a soutenu sa thèse de doctorat en 2006 sur la typologie des systèmes casuels, plus précisément des systèmes à 2 cas. Puis en 2019, il a soutenu son habilitation aussi à l'Académie des sciences à Moscou sur la typologie aréale de la perfectivisation préfixale. Pendant tout ce temps, il a travaillé comme professeur associé d'abord et après comme professeur plein à l'Université nationale russe des humanités. Il a également toujours collaboré avec des projets internationaux, notamment à Vilnius, où il a travaillé sur les langues baltes, et à Mayence. En juillet de l'année dernière, il a quitté la Russie pour des raisons évidentes. Et puis, depuis, il a intégré un projet à Zurich pendant 6 mois. Après, il est parti pour 6 mois à Mayence, où il est employé toujours là, en ce moment. Et maintenant, il a obtenu une bourse Marie Curie avec laquelle il va se rendre à Freiburg, au sud de l'Allemagne, où il va rester pendant une année. Peter est l'auteur et co-éditeur de plusieurs volumes sur des thématiques variées, mais toujours liées à la morphologie complexe, qu'il regarde d'un point de vue typologique, avec une spécialisation en langue balte et slave et caucasienne, notamment au nord-ouest du Caucase, où il a où il a passé plusieurs séjours de terrain. Il a publié plus de 30 articles dans des revues, dans des journaux internationaux et volumes collectifs. Et une des thématiques qui l'intéresse particulièrement, c'est ce qu'on appelle polysynthèse, qui est un phénomène assez rare, on pense. Bon, on va peut-être être éclairci là-dessus, pendant ce séminaire. Et aussi, les chercheurs qui travaillent sur le phénomène sont assez rares. Assez rares. Donc ça me fait très plaisir que Peter est venu ici pour partager ses connaissances avec nous pendant 4 séances, là, en ce mois de mai 2023. Merci.
Thank you very much for being here, and thank you very much for inviting me here, and I think I should really thank Katharina Haude for proposing this idea to me and for her support, and also for taking care of the organizational and technical issues. Thank you very much indeed. Danke schön. So I'm going to speak about polysynthesis from a typological perspective, and also focus on one particular language family I have worked on, that is the Northwest Caucasian. And in this first seminar, I'm going to tackle the most general question: what in fact is polysynthesis, if there is such a thing at all. So we'll start with a very brief and fragmentary history of the notion. Then I'll give a couple of examples, and then we'll discuss some current definitions of polysynthesis, And then I'll tackle such issues as vagueness and heterogeneity of this notion, as well as certain potential correlates of polysynthesis that have been proposed. So let's start with a brief history. The term polysynthesis was introduced by a French-American linguist and philosopher, Pierre-E du Ponceau, also known in English as Peter Stephen du Ponceau. And in his treatise on the languages of the Native Americans, he writes, Le caractère général des langues américaines consiste en ce qu'elles réunissent un grand nombre d'idées sous la forme d'un seul mot. C'est ce qui leur a fait donner par les philologues américains le nom des langues polysynthetic. But it's not the first time this term has been introduced, because it probably first appears in du Ponceau's other publication, which I quote after one of the recent overviews, where he speaks that polysynthetic structures are such in which the greatest number of ideas are comprised in the least number of words. This is a very nice quotation. So first, the notion of polysynthesis was applied to the languages of Native Americans. And indeed, probably North America is the most polysynthetic region of the world. Then it was applied to Chukotkan languages. But later, of course, similar structures were found elsewhere in other parts of the world. And the term got its currency. Importantly, polysynthesis is a sort of a holistic notion. From the very beginning, linguists tended to speak about polysynthetic languages rather than about polysynthetic constructions, for instance. And importantly, they still tend to do it. We still talk about polysynthetic languages and don't find anything strange about it. Whereas, for instance, I think that linguists have more or less stopped talking about ergative languages or agglutinative languages after it has been convincingly shown that, for instance, a language can have ergative patterning in one construction and some other type of patterning in another construction. Or agglutinative verbs and fusional or flexive nouns or whatever. However, again, polysynthesis seems to be a notion that linguists tend to apply to whole languages, something that is sort of a basic overall characteristic, whether it's right or not. So, how can linguists try to render the characterization proposed by du Ponceau, a great number of ideas in a small number of words, in a more objective, testable, probably quantifiable fashion? So Mithun, in one of her important papers on polysynthesis, writes that polysynthetic languages are by definition those that exhibit a high number of morphemes per word. And this she certainly relies on Joseph Greenberg, who in his famous article on the quantitative morphological typology of languages, proposed a line of synthesis based on his index of synthesis that is a ratio of morphemes per word in a running text. And in this way, polysynthetic is just the extreme point on this scale, ranging from isolating through analytic, synthetic to polysynthetic. And according to Greenberg, polysynthetic languages are simply those that have 3 or more morphemes per word in a running text, on average. And this is an extremely simple, one could even say simplistic characterization in and of itself. And for instance, Greenberg applies his synthesis index and also other indices he proposed to a range of languages, and here Westernlandic is an example of polysynthetic languages with a 3.72, almost 4 morphemes per word on average, which is by far more than in any synthetic language like Sanskrit, for instance. And you might note that the leap between Sanskrit, his most synthetic language in his sample, and Westernlandic is greater than the leap between Sanskrit and, for instance, Persian, which is, according to Greenberg, analytic. But of course, if we take much more languages, then we will probably see a more or less continuous climb. And of course, there is a problem with this characterization of Greenberg, simple and straightforward as it might seem, because, well, languages can have more than 3 morphemes per word on average for all sorts of reasons and in very different ways. And this quantitative approach doesn't even ask the question why some languages have so many morphemes per word and others don't. So I side with Fortescue, with Michael Fortescue, who wrote that polysynthetic languages are more than just languages with very long words which have a high number of morphemes per word. I don't know if it was supposed to make question answer periods in between. But we might. Yes, Alex.
I just had a quick question. So in those kind of calculations, which you just showed, how are portmanteau morphemes shown? Like a single morphemes which encodes plural and case and person in a single and analyze it. There's a kind of
yeah. So it's, as far as I remember, Greenberg's paper. His definition of morpheme is a meaningful unit that is an analyzable and that can be singled out on formal grounds and have some identifiable content. So if for him a portmanteau morpheme is one morpheme. So if it has many meanings combined, but none of these meanings can be attributed to some piece of form, then it's just one morpheme. So polysynthetic languages are more than just languages with very long words. and I'll spend most of this course trying to show this. So let's have a look at some examples actually of very long words. So this is Barbareño Chumash, an extinct language of California. This verbal form consists of a number of morphemes, and some of these morphemes are let me put it semantically quite loaded. So it's not only person, number of the subject and habitual aspect, but also things that are translated into English by full words. Like do something before something else, do something partially, etc. This is Tiwi, an Australian language, where you see that a whole English sentence with several content words, meet, asleep, steal, etc., is expressed by something that at least is glossed and analyzed as a single verbal form. This is a Baza, one of the languages I have worked on, and here it's a full biclausal sentence with a complement taking predicate and its complement clause. It seemed to him that I would be able to pass there, again encoded as a single verbal form. But now something a bit more surprising. This is Lithuanian, a well-behaved Indo-European language in the heart of Europe. Nobody has ever considered Lithuanian among polysynthetic languages, but Lithuanian can also have very long and complex verbs. It can also encode something that is translated by a rather lengthy English sentences in single words. So is it also polysynthesis? Again, no one has considered Lithuanian a polysynthetic language. But we have to ask why. If it's not polysynthesis, why isn't it? And I have actually discussed this question in a recent paper of mine. And this example actually brings us to the most important point, that we have to try to define what is polysynthesis, to come up with a certain definition if we want to meaningfully distinguish between languages we want to call polysynthetic and those we don't want to call polysynthetic. Because, well, it should not be just a matter of tradition, that, for instance, we call Mohawk polysynthetic, but we don't call Lithuanian polysynthetic. There should be some reason for this. So let's turn to the definitions of polysynthesis, and the probably frustrating thing that I'm going to start this discussion with is that there is no generally accepted, uniform, agreed upon definition of polysynthesis that all linguists would endorse. All linguists who talk about polysynthesis would endorse. Even in the Oxford Handbook of Polysynthesis, which is more than 1,000 pages long, there isn't a definition of polysynthesis that all authors of this book adhere to. So let's look at some of the definitions that have been proposed in the recent literature. So Nicholas Evans and Hans-Jürgen Suss said in their introduction to a volume called Problems of Polysynthesis, the first typologically oriented book devoted to polysynthetic languages, in the recent typological literature. So they write that a prototypical, and I'd like to draw your attention to this word, a prototypical polysynthetic language is one in which it is possible, in a single word, to use processes of morphological composition to encode information about both the predicate and all its arguments to a level of specificity allowing this word to serve alone as a freestanding utterance without reliance on context. This is probably not a definition in the strict sense of the word, rather a characterization, but a characterization containing quite a lot of information. Michael Fortescue, one of the co-editors of the Oxford Handbook of Polysynthesis, writes in his chapter there that to qualify a score polysynthetic, and again I draw your attention to this core, a language must display holophrasis, that is, be able to represent the whole clause, including all bound core pronominals by a single word, and must allow more than one lexically heavy morpheme within the holophrastic verb. So Fortescue defines polysynthesis as a conjunction of two actually independent properties. The one is related to argument expression. Polysynthetic languages express all arguments by bound pronouns in the verb, or at least they express no less than two arguments of a transitive verb. But this is not enough. For a language to qualify as core polysynthetic, in addition to holophrasis, it has to include a certain derivational or lexical component to its verbal morphology, these lexically heavy morphemes. A different definition is proposed by Johannes Mithun, also in the Oxford Handbook. She writes that languages qualify as polysynthetic if they have complex polymorphemic verbal units which necessarily integrate productive non-root bound morphemes with lexical and grammatical meanings. So Mithun actually bases her definition only on the second part of Fortescue's definition. For her, what is most important is these lexically heavy morphemes. Whereas such notions as argument expression, polypersonalism, holophrasis aren't even mentioned in her definition. So linguists really don't agree upon the definition of polysynthetic languages and polysynthesis, and it's a problem. and we'll try to tackle it. So, if there isn't an agreed upon definition, and if all definitions hinge upon notions which themselves need to be defined, which are not at all self-evident. It's not at all self-evident what a lexically heavy morpheme is. So, by necessity, the notion of polysynthesis is vague and internally heterogeneous. So the boundaries of polysynthesis are fuzzy. Languages, well, as you have seen, existing definitions of polysynthesis speak about prototypical or core polysynthetic languages. So, in other words, a language can be more polysynthetic than some other language. There can be prototypical and non-prototypical core and peripheral polysynthetic languages. And overall, the boundaries of the class of polysynthetic languages, if it's possible to call it a class at all, are fuzzy and transient. This isn't probably bad in and of itself because, well, languages don't become polysynthetic overnight. So probably there should be intermediate boundary cases, but still it doesn't free us linguists of the necessity to make this notion more precise. So we have to ask which criteria define this prototype of polysynthesis and how they can be evaluated in qualitative and probably quantitative terms. So, for instance, getting to this notion of lexically heavy morphemes. What is it actually? What counts as lexically heavy? For example, do the so-called proverbs or verbal prefixes that occur in many European languages, Baltic, Slavic, Germanic, Latin, do they count as lexically heavy? Do these guys from Lithuanian that correspond to lexical elements in English, are they lexically heavy morphemes or not? And we'll discuss it in some more detail next time. Here I only want to draw your attention to this phenomenon and to say that it's not a straightforward question whether these elements are lexically heavy or not. Because if they are, this is an argument in favor of treating Lithuanian or Slavic or German as, let me put it this way, relevant for the discussion of polysynthesis. Holophrasis is apparently a more straightforward notion, but still we have to ask certain questions about it. So usually linguists speak about linguists seem to think that if a language encodes both arguments of a transitive verb in the verb, then it's enough for the language counting as exhibiting polyphrasis or something like that. At least for Fortescue, it definitely should be the case, because his favorite Eskimo languages don't encode more than 2 arguments in their verbs. So 2 should be definitely enough. But still, what about cases when there are more than 2 arguments? What if there are applicatives that add arguments to the verb? Should we require that applied objects are also indexed? What about more peripheral arguments, such as, for instance, locations with verbs of displacement? There are languages which index them, and there are languages that don't index them. Is this distinction relevant for speaking about prototypical versus non-prototypical polysynthesis or not? These are all relevant questions. The very general question is how to measure morphological complexity at all beyond Greenberg's syntheticity index. Because polysynthesis is, in the most general respect, it's about morphological complexity. It's usually connected to extreme morphological complexity in the verb. So, how to measure morphological complexity at all? This topic has attracted quite a bit of attention recently. And for instance, in the volume that Francesco Gordani and myself have co-edited, we argue, the authors of this volume actually argue collectively, that there are complexities in morphology rather than one holistic morphological complexity. That there are different types of morphological complexity which can and usually do manifest themselves simultaneously in one and the same language, and they should probably not be lumped together but rather teased apart and, if necessary, quantified on their own, rather than simply lumped and subsumed under some very general holistic notion. So we can ask various questions, like for instance, how many lexically heavy morphemes are there in the language system, that is paradigmatically? How many lexically heavy morphemes can occur in a single verb syntagmatically? And of course, these two questions are not the same. How productive these morphemes are. Which actually amounts to the question how productive each of these morphemes is. How freely do they combine with roots and with each other, if at all, etc., etc. And there are, of course, many more facets of morphological complexity which I simply don't mention here. And finally, all definitions of polysynthesis crucially hinge on the notion of word. And we have to ask, what is a word? And we all know that this question is a burning one, and that there have been quite a lot of discussion about the notion of bird and its viability as and its utility as a concept of general linguistics, also with respect to polysynthesis and polysynthetic languages. It is common knowledge that, for instance, phonological and morphosyntactic criteria of wordhood do not always converge, and that even different morphosyntactic criteria of wordhood also do not always converge. And therefore, languages actually vary quite considerably in the degree of robustness of the word versus phrase distinction. And this is of course relevant for polysynthesis, because even if we want to define polysynthesis according to Greenberg, we have to determine what a word in this language is. So, to give some examples, in Mapudungun, a language spoken in Chile, this is a polysynthetic verbal form. They are going around gathering shrimp, a single word with an incorporated nominal root, some lexical affixes, etc., and it is morphosyntactically a coherent string. It cannot be broken up by anything, its components can't be permutated, etc. However, phonologically, it is divided into 3 separate domains of stress assignment. So, morphosyntactically, it's 1 word, whereas phonologically, it is probably 3 words. That might be considered an embarrassment, but it's a fact and we have to live with it. Another example from Chocobo, a Panoan language, monumentally described by Adam Tolman, who's also shown here. And Adam Tolman is one of the people who has been doing extremely important and innovative work on birdhood recently. See the references above. And by the way, I think I should have started with it, but the list of references for this course is or probably will be soon available on the LabX website. So this is an apparently polysynthetic verbal form in Chocobo, consisting of a number of morphemes. But the interesting thing is, and it exhibits certain wordhood properties. For instance, its component can't stand alone, occur in a certain order, but very interestingly, it's actually not really coherent, because this complex can be split by a noun phrase actually in almost any place. You can put the noun phrase here, or here, or here, or here. So this string it's ambivalent, because in one sense all these elements belong together, but their degree of morphosyntactic coherence is low, because exactly because noun phrases can split this complex, and even in many places. So the notion word is actually problematic for Jacobo, and Jacobo is not the only language for which this notion is problematic, and hence we have to take these facts at face value and somehow consider them in our discussions of polysynthesis as well. So, coming back to more general things, Johannes Mithun, in one of her papers, writes that polysynthesis is not a homogeneous principle of language structure, but actually comprises a range of heterogeneous phenomena, such as polypersonalism, noun incorporation, etc. And indeed, there is a number of characteristic features which are associated with polysynthesis, such as polypersonalism, that is expression of arguments by both pronominal affixes, of more than one argument, preferably as many arguments as possible. Also, such thing as productive non-inflectional concatenation is a special kind of morphology, and I will talk about it next time. Also, lexical affixes, these lexically heavy morphemes with very concrete and specific meanings, incorporation of different kinds, and probably some other things. And these features, they don't necessarily correlate. There are languages that have all of them. There are languages that have only a subset of them. And some of the languages that have only a subset of these features are called polysynthetic, while others are not. And probably one of the possible approaches to polysynthesis is to take all these characteristic features seriously, one after another, investigate how they manifest themselves in languages and whether they correlate and to which extent and how exactly. And we'll talk more about these features in Seminar 2, but actually I won't talk much about the correlations. So the last topic for today would be possible correlates of polysynthesis, possible implications of these fuzzy and heterogeneous notions. So Mayence Mithun, in the very same paper that she starts with the blunt statement that polysynthetic languages are by definition those that have many morphemes per word. Actually, this paper is all about qualitative features. And she writes a very interesting thing, that the propensity of polysynthetic languages to develop morphological complexity primarily within their verbs can have a subtle effect both on the semantic nature of the categories they grammaticalize and on the resulting structure of their morphological systems. And she continues that verb-centered polysynthetic languages differ semantically and structurally from those with more elaborate nominal morphology. But one asserts the other can imply. What is inflectional in one is derivational in the other. And she provides some empirical evidence for these statements. So one could ask, is it indeed the case that highly complex verbal morphology implies simpler nominal morphology and simpler nominal morphosyntax? Well, sometimes yes, sometimes no. And actually, Johanna Mithun, in another paper of hers, writes that although nominal complexity is in principle independent of the morphological type of a language, it is most common in polysynthetic languages. And I hope we'll have time to discuss it briefly next time. So there are indeed languages where most of morphological complexity is concentrated in verbs, whereas nouns are simple. But it's not necessarily so. And of course, actually, as I'll show you when we'll talk about Northwest Caucasian languages, a language can show very complex verbs and very complex nouns, but the types of complexity may differ across these two domains. So, another possible way of looking at polysynthesis is to consider it a specific type of drawing boundaries between lexicon and grammar on the one hand, and within grammar between morphology and syntax on the other hand. Let's see what I mean. For instance, if according to another quotation by Ponceau, in polysynthetic languages, on peut former des mots à l'infini. One can form words indefinitely. If this is true, then perhaps the distinction between inflection and derivation, whatever these terms mean, and more generally between lexical storage and online creation of complex morphological units is blurred. However, as a growing body of literature shows, even in languages with highly productive and very complex verbal morphology, much more is actually stored than one might imagine. There is also some evidence from first language acquisition about some qualitative differences between polysynthetic and non-polysynthetic languages. For instance, Allen, in her chapter on the acquisition of Inuit in Oxford Handbook of Polysynthesis, writes that children acquiring Inuit languages become competent with this complex morphosyntax at an early age, producing productive causatives, passives, and non-incorporation structures as early as age 2, and she adds that this presents a striking contrast to children learning English, who are still struggling with basic morphology at the same age. And as a native speaker of Russian, I think literature on first language acquisition of Russian also shows that children have troubles with Russian morphology at the age of 2. So L1 acquisition in these languages, unfortunately, is very poorly studied, and it should actually be a preference for linguists to study it before, while these languages are required at all still. Fortescue, in a more general way, also with reference to acquisition and production, writes that the learner's ability to produce new verb forms will continue throughout life. And it is these skills of imitation, interpretation, and innovation that are passed on from generation to generation and which may nudge the language forward gradually to greater and greater complexity. However, Mithun writes that the lexicon and the memory of existing words may actually play a much greater role in this language in its Mohawk, but probably it is also true of other polysynthetic languages. So the lexicon, the memory of existing words may play a much greater role than the highly productive morphology might lead a casual observer to suspect. So still, even in these languages, that is both lexically stored and online produced morphology, and they interact in interesting ways. Turning to the distinction between morphology and syntax, one could probably say that in polysynthetic languages, primarily verbal morphology is employed to express and manage syntactic relations both intra- and interclausally to the greatest possible extent. And I'll show some examples of this in my discussion of Northwest Caucasian. And in turn, the productive subsystems of polysynthetic morphology often display certain syntax-like properties, such as additivity, compositionality, and recursion, something which is characteristic of what Willem de Reuze calls productive non-inflectional concatenation, a subtype of morphology which is, according to de Reuze, distinct from both inflection and derivation. We'll talk about it next time. But still, even in these polysynthetic languages, morphology and syntax tend to remain distinct. And again, I'll try to show it for Northwest Caucasian languages. So, could we think of such correlation as the one between highly complex morphology and somewhat simpler syntax? This has actually been proposed in the literature, where it has been put forward that polysynthetic languages tend to show such properties of their syntax as non-configurationality, that is free constituent order and general optionality of noun-phrases, rare use of free pronouns, absence of at least core case marking, absence of certain non-finite verbal constructions, and some other properties. But again, even if some polysynthetic languages show some of these properties, it's not true that all of them do. And we'll talk more about it in Seminar 4. Again, as I have already told you, polysynthesis presupposes extreme morphological complexity. And any kind of morphological complexity takes time to develop. And extreme morphological complexity apparently takes really long time to develop. And on the other hand, it's vulnerable in situations of asymmetric language contact, as has been shown by certain studies of language obsolescence in polysynthetic languages. Moreover, polysynthesis seems to be favored by specific sociolinguistic conditions, such as small communities with dense social networks, geographical isolation, and in general low contact, and therefore no or few second language speakers. And as we all know, however it could have been in the past, at present there aren't, well, at present the conditions in the world don't favor these sociolinguistic settings, and so it's not surprising that most polysynthetic languages are endangered, even those of them that have some advanced sociolinguistic status, as for instance Abkhaz, which is officially a state language of a non-recognized state, but in fact isn't really used enough not to be endangered. So, a brief outlook for the next 3 seminars. In seminar 2, I'm going to speak much more and in greater detail on cross-linguistic variation of polysynthesis and the fringes of this notion. In seminar 3, I shall present a general introduction to the Northwest Caucasian languages and an overview of their polysynthetic morphology. And in seminar 4, I shall focus on the relations between syntax and morphology in polysynthetic languages, again with emphasis on the Northwest Caucasian. And my focus on Northwest Caucasian is precisely because I have worked in these languages and can have, so to say, first-hand data and can bear more responsibility on what I'm talking about. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Peter. That was fascinating. Are there any questions?
What you said about the early acquisition of polysynthesis, as noted by some author, reminded me of when our nephew started speaking. He produced some nominal compounds. As you know, German uses loads of nominal compounds. Before he had any verbal morphology, not even of the most frequent verbs, and not even such things as is or was. So I was very surprised. But perhaps it can be related to other people's observations. For instance, about this noun incorporation, perhaps there is some relation or some similarity here.
Thank you for this question. I'm afraid, well, first of all, I'm not a specialist in language acquisition at all, so I can't say anything meaningful on this. And second, well, at least for the case of German compounds, I would say that this is probably not surprising, because the mechanism of compounding in German is very transparent and productive, isn't it? Well, I think it's more transparent than verbal morphology. And so probably it's easier to acquire and handle than the other verbal morphology, than verbal morphology. However, as far as I understood this paper on the acquisition of Inuit, I would tentatively say that children acquiring Inuit simply don't have any choice. They have to acquire this morphology because one simply cannot speak the language at all without using at least part of it. And so, unfortunately, I have absolutely no data on the acquisition of the very complex verbal morphology in Northwest Caucasian languages. I only have some anecdotal evidence of, well, children, of course, not of 2 years of age, but children of, say, 7 years of age, being more or less perfect speakers, at least in terms of using the basic morphology, basic verbal morphology, which is quite complex. So I don't know. The only thing I can say that it would be really important to document the acquisition of as many polysynthetic languages as is still possible. Yes, please, Mark.
Yes, right. I wasn't entirely sure to understand what your view is on the usefulness on the notion of polysynthesis, because in the beginning I thought you were going to say, well, it's a nice idea, but we probably don't really need it, and towards the end I started to doubt. So, as you know, I work on the Bantu languages. The Bantu languages are very often characterized as agglutinating, which is very flawed also, obviously, as a term, because it combines high synthesis and low degree of fusion, which is wrong for the Bantu languages. They have sometimes spectacularly non-linear morphology. But people use it as a kind of a shorthand. Okay, this is the kind of language we're working with. You don't expect Mandarin or Yoruba, etc. And so from that point of view, it seems useful to me. So when you made a list of the correlates that have been proposed in the literature, most of them struck me as trivial. And as you answered, I mean, obviously the acquisition argument. So obviously kids need to learn this fast, otherwise they can't say anything. So, could you specify your view on the usefulness of the notion of polysynthesis for linguists?
Thank you. Well, I was actually going to talk about it in the conclusions to my next seminar.
The reason I'm asking this now is because I will be traveling.
Yeah, of course it is. It's important. Well, I must confess that I'm somewhat non-committal, because on the one hand, I fully recognize all the problems that are associated with this notion, and I understand that it's fuzzy, it's ill-defined, and so, well, if I were a Haspelmark, I would certainly throw it into the basket. But I'm not, and I think, and well, one of the ways I'm not Haspelmark is that I don't think that prototypes are bad, and I think that there might be something interesting, at least in trying to, well, instead of throwing the notion of polysynthesis into the basket, I think it's more interesting to try to reconstruct it in some meaningful way. For instance, by disentangling these different components that are more usually associated with polysynthesis, are exploring their cross-linguistic variation, which is not limited to the languages that are usually considered polysynthetic. So, for instance, if I were to work on a real sample-based typology of polysynthesis, which I'm sort of planning to, but it depends on many things, I would certainly include Bantu languages because, well, even if they are not usually included into polysynthetic type, they are fairly close because they share certain characteristics, and so one should ask to what extent these characteristics are shared. As I have shown you, well, as I have hinted upon with Lithuanian, another language of my expertise, which I would say I'll reiterate that it has never been considered to belong to the polysynthetic class. I think it's, well, I could say that it's not polysynthetic, period. But I think it's much more important to ask, okay, it's not polysynthetic, but why? What are the features that it shares with the languages that are usually considered polysynthetic? Is this difference qualitative or just quantitative? Are there languages that, for instance, tend to develop into the direction of something which is prototypically polysynthetic because, again, all these features take time to develop. So languages accrue and acquire polysynthetic properties in a gradual manner. So, I think that well, returning to your very general question, I think that this notion is useful to the extent that it's interesting and allows to investigate interesting things and ask interesting questions. But if in the end it turns out that these properties don't actually correlate and don't even form one cluster, but rather form several distinct clusters, which don't share much with each other, this will really be empirical evidence, I think, for abandoning this notion. I hope I have answered your question at least to some extent.
I maybe add if you're interested in naive views on the, on the question, for me I always thought that in order to qualify as polysynthetic, you needed to have at least non-incorporation. I thought that this was kind of necessary, and that's why Bantu, etc., Bantu languages were never characterized as polysynthetic. So just to share my naive views.
Well, are the problem is that there are languages that are traditionally called polysynthetic, which don't have non-incorporation, starting with the Eskimo languages, which, well, sometimes some scholars write about non-incorporation in Eskimo, but it's actually, even if there is, it's very different from our non-incorporation found in Algonquin, for instance. Well, for the simple reason that there aren't if there is non-incorporation in Eskimo languages, then the class of verbs that can incorporate nouns are the verbs that can't be used without incorporated nouns. So one of the received views is that there isn't any incorporation proper in these languages, but rather there is productive verbalization by means of affixes. And again, this is a matter of definition, but everything is a matter of definition. And Northwest Caucasian languages, of course, also don't have productive non-incorporation, and I have some ideas on the type of incorporation they have, and I even have presented some of it here last year. I'll talk a bit about it in Seminar 3. Anyway, for instance, for Mithun, the defining feature is not incorporation, but these lexically heavy affixes.
I have a sort of meta question, which is about what it is that you think we should be doing, or what you have started to do today. I can see two ways to handle the literature. One would be to take it, to accept the notion of polysynthesis and for one thing, and the other thing, to accept maybe that Inuktitut is polysynthetic and Lithuanian is not, because it's never been so sort of accept or consider it as a sort of established fact. And then our work, or your work, would be to try and see what it is behind this classification, that sort of intuitive view of polysynthesis. How can we capture the parameters, maybe partly subconscious or partly intuitive, that have been used to conclude that Lithuanian is not, and Eskimo languages are. So that could be one way to go. Another, and I think this is what Martin Hasselmann calls the retro definition. So there's been this use of this technical word with different, definitions or different, or sometimes just intuitive application to some languages, and we try to retro define what has been called accusative in the language, or what has been called instrumental and stuff. Okay. The other way, I'm not saying one way is better than the other, I'm just thinking, the other way would say, okay, here is a Lithuanian, not only in one sentence, but perhaps other data from Lithuanian. It's never been called polysynthetic, but according to a definition I'm proposing, or which has been proposed, there's no reason to not call it polysynthetic. So in this case, the approach will be slightly different, because you're sort of allowing yourself to say, actually Mandarin is polysynthetic, or French maybe, or so on. And these are two, in terms of methodology, or both approaches are interesting and productive, but they don't take the same angle to the question, right? You see what I mean? So, what do you think of that? I was wondering what would be your conclusion about Lithuanian, for instance? Would you say, isn't it polysynthetic? Because it's convincingly, it's a convincing example that it could be, that you may want to redefine Lithuanian, or the other way, it would be to say, this looks polysynthetic, but of course it's not. and let's think why it is not. What is your approach here?
Thank you, Alex. Well, I think that my approach is prototype-based. So one could take the properties that are usually associated with polysynthesis, and well, since there is quite a lot of literature and quite a bit of ink has been spilled about it, so there is a more or less agreed upon list of these properties, and since these properties are, at least some of them, are better defined than the notion of polysynthesis in itself, we can try to investigate them. Probably the burst of these properties, the one which isn't well defined, is these lexical affixes, on which quite a bit of things hinge. But again, Mithun in her work has tried to define them in some way. I must confess that I don't find it entirely satisfactory, but still it's very useful. It's something that can be worked with. And the problem is that if we take her definition seriously, then Lithuanian, I don't want to say that Lithuanian is polysynthetic because, well, probably because it looks like a scandal or whatever, or probably simply because I don't want to say that a language is polysynthetic if it shows only one of these properties, for example. But what is important, Lithuanian shares with core for prototypical polysynthetic languages at least one of the properties, that is lexical affixes. And then the question we should ask is, what kind of affixes are these, how they behave, how many are there, how many can occur in a single verb, how productive they are they, in which respects are they similar and in which respects they differ from, I don't know, similar affixes in other languages, such as Northwest Caucasian, for instance. Because, well, as I'll show you in Seminar 3, Northwest Caucasian languages also have plenty of locative affixes. And Lithuanian has some locative affixes. So they are similar in this respect. But, of course, one has to ask to what extent are they similar and to what extent they differ. And so I think this is a viable approach. But
I have another question, but I'll let other people.
Yeah, I was wondering whether the problem doesn't hinge on this idea of this holistic definition. Why don't we speak of languages with the polysynthetic traits, and then, for instance, that can be the verbal domain or the nominal domain, or within one of those, or and then you could kind of treat them independently.
yes,
And then
exactly.
you might get, well, not to a gradual definition because those are on different levels, but so, I mean, speaking of polysynthetic language, indeed, that sounds a bit strange, right? If it's a shorthand for a language with many polysynthetic traits, then
Exactly.
it would be more comprehensive.
And the
Exactly.
point I was going to make, it was a bit similar actually to Catharina's excellent notion. And I was thinking of canonical typology, I call it. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
Where-
very much defined canonically.
Exactly. So one could think of one sort of ideal pole of a sort of maximally polysynthetic language, which would be, I don't know, polysynthetic means noun phrases or nouns, and its verbs have noun incorporation, have all the sort of properties we imagine of a polysynthetic language, whether this type is embodied in a real language or not, you know, and then have several parameters actually where you can sort of vary along several dimensions and have both, and then end up saying, okay, this, you know, the Arenge in Australia is polysynthetic in dimensions, you know, 1, 2, 7, and 8, you know, but not in this. Perhaps kind of define some kind of metric. I don't know which is sort of, yeah.
I agree. This could be one of possible approaches, although well, I haven't thought of it in these terms. Well, actually, well, to tell the truth, actually I have, but I haven't thought enough to even try to approach a canonical definition. And actually, for what I know about canonical definitions, I like them quite a lot. I like this approach by Graf Corbett and his associates, but it's not at all an easy thing to come up with a good canonical definition of anything, especially when it is something as complex and heterogeneous as polysynthesis. So I'm not even sure that it would really make sense. I don't know. Anyway, I'm not a person to judge. Yes.
I guess it's kind of the points, I think, of canonical typology is to try to handle very intricate and entangled issues by separating them in a sort of Cartesian way. But I've never applied it. I've read about it or I've listened to Graf Corbett, but I've never tried. So it may be you may be right that it's difficult to apply. Actually.
Maybe a very small remark. I totally agree. I was also all the time thinking about canonical typology as a perfect way, in my view, to apply it. In the very beginning, the history of the concept, there too I'm probably going to expose my textbook knowledge of morphology, but I always thought that polysynthesis was added as a fourth term to Schlegel's typology, Schlegel's typology of languages, which was logically incomplete because it lacked one of the value combinations, namely extreme synthesis plus extreme fusion. But you didn't mention that at all.
Yes, thank you. Well, I didn't mention it. Well, this brief history is certainly extremely brief and fragmentary. And also, well, it wasn't my aim at all to provide a history of the notion, a real historical analysis. But you're right.
The reason I'm saying this is because, in a sense, it is a mini canonical typology already, because they take two separate features of variation, which each have two values, and then say, okay, what would it look like if both values were extreme on each feature?
Well, I'm actually not sure because, well, again, I'm not well versed enough in this history of ideas of the 19th century, but for what I know, if I'm not mistaken, it was Humboldt who added this fourth term to Schlegel's typology. And Humboldt called these languages, of course, he used a German term which I don't remember. Well, in English it's translated like incorporating. So I think his idea, the prototypical language was Nahuatl or something like this, I think. And for him, the most important property was incorporation. This possibility of packaging the whole sentence into one word. Whereas I think again, fortunately it's not my domain. I think Ponceau's development of ideas was largely independent of these European trends in typology, and I don't think he was limiting his what he understood by polysynthesis to languages with incorporation. So it was actually not, I think it probably took some time. It probably was Sapir who, or it probably was Sapir who actually used the term polysynthetic within this more general morphological typology comprising synthetic, analytic, and oscillating. And again, Sapir certainly didn't only mean incorporation there. So there was actually not a single line of development of these ideas, but I'm really not a specialist who can talk about it reliably.
If there are no more questions now, I would like to point out that the slides can be found on the internet, on the LabX website, where also this recording will eventually be stored. And, well, thank you very much, Peter.
Thank you.
For this very nice first seminar, and we're looking forward to the next 3 Tuesday evenings.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.